Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrea Himoff. I am the Executive Director of Action Utah. And for those of you who don't know Action Utah, we are a nonpartisan community advocacy organization that empowers Utahns from both sides of the aisle to get civically engaged to impact the issues they care about most. Now, during the 2020 elections, we're doing a lot of work to provide nonpartisan informational resources to help get out the vote and ensure that Utahns can cast an informed vote up and down the ballot. Today, we're launching our What's on Your Ballot series, a series of 4 events starting today with What's on Your Ballot, Removing Slavery from the Utah Constitution, or Constitutional Amendment C. This event will be recorded and posted on our website and social media platforms so that more Utahns can view it later throughout the election season. And please feel free to share it among your networks as well so that people are well informed about this issue. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. Very honored to welcome Representative Sandra Hollins from House District 23. Representative Hollins is a Democrat from Salt Lake City. Joining us shortly will be Senator Jake Anderegg from Senate District 13. Senator Anderegg is a Republican from Lehigh. We also have Robert Burch, president of the Utah chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, as well as Jason Groth, Smart Justice Attorney from ACLU Utah. Thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to a very informative conversation with you. So let's get started by talking about the background of this issue and the proposed constitutional amendment to address it. And perhaps we should start with you, Robert. You have such a wealth of information about the history of this. Of course, we believe that slavery was abolished in America via the 13th Amendment in 1865, and yet here it appears in the Utah Constitution as a punishment for a crime. Why is that?
That's because only a certain type of slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. So technically, slavery never ended in the United States. And so it exists in what we're talking about today with Amendment C as a form of penal labor or penal slavery. There is an exception in the 13th Amendment clause that says, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. And it literally states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude is possible in the United States except for a crime. And so this left a lot of implications for African Americans, especially when with the Black codes that was created after the Civil War that incarcerated particularly Black men for things like loitering, for things like walking down the street and not having a job. Just so very simple things. For speaking disrespectful to a white man, you could be arrested and then put into basically a penal workforce to work for corporations. And this has been going on since pretty early after the Civil War.
And is slavery allowed, excuse me, is slavery allowed under other state constitutions as well, or is it only the Utah Constitution?
Comparing the exception clause in the United States Constitution to the Utah Constitution, it is verbatim the same language, with the exception of location. That is the only difference. Whereas in the United States Constitution, it says the United States and its jurisdictions, it says particularly in our Constitution, Utah, but otherwise the language is verbatim. So that literally leaves it open.
Okay, I found this on the web, particularly in our Constitution.
Sorry, that's my theory. So that pretty much left it open, particularly for the incarceration of Black men, to put them into a slave system, again, for corporations who utilize this the state for labor. I think probably the most popular idea we have of that is when we see in movies about chain gang and things of that nature, where they would have road crews who built roads. Those guys not only built roads, they did industrial work that could have been going to the greater population, except for the fact that it was less expensive to have the prisoners do it.
Thank you. It's really helpful to understand where this came from. Representative Hollins, can you tell us about your 2019 resolution HJR 8 and what that resolution said and how it has led to this proposed constitutional amendment?
Sure. So back in 2018 and 19, I had been watching Colorado do this, and I had watched them take this out of their constitution. And I had watched the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay. And so I had an understanding of what this is and how this language got into the state constitution and to the United States Constitution. And so I had been watching it, but it never dawned on me to check Utah's constitution. And so just happened one night, late one evening, one night, I was up working and my phone rang, and it was Brittany Johnson from Channel 4 News who called me, and she said, "Are you aware that this is in our Utah's constitution?" And my response was, "Are you sure?" Really? She said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm sending you all of the information now." And so she sent the information and I started reading it. And so I called her back and she said, "Well, what do you think? What are your thoughts?" And I said, "Well, we need to get this out of our constitution. This no longer fits our values and who we are in the state of Utah." And so that's how it began. That was the beginning of getting this out of our Utah Constitution. We had to start working on closing that chapter in our history, and also to start having that conversation around Black history and what this means and why this was placed in our Constitution. Because, you know, Utah became a state in 1896, I believe. And the Emancipation Proclamation in 13 was written, in 1863, 64, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this was written in almost 30 something years after that. And historians have told me, well, maybe it was written in because they were still trying to become a state and be recognized by the United States as a state. So it could have been written in for that reason. Whatever the reason is, it's time for it to be taken out of our Constitution.
And maybe, Robert, you can weigh in a little bit about how it actually ended up in the Utah Constitution. You have some information about that as well.
It ended up in the Utah Constitution as Brigham Young was the territorial governor at the time. And the Latter-day Saints back then were having a huge problem. Remember, they were being chased out west. They've been chased out of New York and New Jersey, clear across the north and out into Utah. And so once they decided that this is where they want to stay, they then had to turn and deal with some of the things that was coming out of the East, particularly as it pertained to what a democracy is. Most Europeans felt that the only people on earth who were capable of operating a democracy were Europeans, not Africans or anyone of brown skin or Asian or anything else. They literally felt that they were the epitome of civilization and everyone else was savages or barbarians. And with them not being able to run a democracy, it became a concern with folks out east that these Latter-day Saints were out in Utah baptizing Africans, baptizing Native Americans, baptizing Asians, and marrying them. So within 40 years of being out here, many people at the East had said that Mormons had already devolved into lesser beings. They had begun to devolve into monkeys, basically. And so Brigham Young, looking at that type of pressure from the government, who says that government can only be run by white folk, And also looking at that, they had droves of new Latter-day Saints coming out of Mississippi, and they were down there being very successfully baptizing slave owners and slaves. And so that too was an idea, an attraction to get those slave owners and slaves to move out to Utah territory because they could keep their slaves. And so Brigham Young addressing this is trying to figure out how he can keep his little colony safe in the Utah territory from the federal government, and at the same time grow the body of the church. And so that was the position that he took, was slavery, and to move the Latter-day Saint church from being inclusive of all people to being exclusive. And so that led him to make that decision to be a slave state. When you look at federal law with the extension of the Mason-Dixon line all the way across the country to the Pacific, Utah was a state that would have naturally been opted out of slavery had they chose to opt out of slavery, but they didn't.
And so in essence, you're saying that there was a real intentionality to putting this language in the Utah Constitution at the time, for reasons that had to do with the politics of that time and the ideals or beliefs of that time, and the needs of the state to expand and grow at that time. Is that accurate? Okay. So
that's pretty accurate.
Okay. So going back to HJR 8, what exactly did that resolution say?
So what it says, the original statement that was put in, it says the same as the 13th, as Mr. Burch said. It said, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within its state. And so the part that was taken out was the part that says, except as punishment for a crime, wherefore the party should have been duly convicted. So what it says is, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within this state, is what HJR 8 says.
And what was your experience passing that in 2019? Did you come up against any opposition, or did you encounter any key support?
You know, I received more support than opposition to this piece of legislation. I overwhelmingly received support from a lot of educators. I had a lot of teachers reach out to me and say that this sparked a conversation within their classrooms, and they were having this conversation, and that they were tuning into the debate to hear the history of this and see how everyone voted. So, and also on the day that I presented this resolution, first in the committee, the committee room was packed. And when the chair asked who in this committee is here to speak against this bill, no one stood up. But when he asked who's here to speak in favor of it, everybody in the room stood up in the room, saying that they were there in favor of the bill. So when it moved over to the House floor, I had the honor of having John Trumpeter Hollins, a freedom rider, sit on the House floor with me. Found out that she was in town, and her family had reached out to me, and I invited her to be there. And so it was such an honor to have such a historical figure. You know, I was starstruck to be able to sit next to her on the House floor. And it passed unanimously. It went over to the Senate, and it didn't pass. It passed unanimously in the Senate, but we had to fight a little bit to get it out, because there was some concerns about the criminal justice system. Some of the senators had concerns about whether this was going to undo our court system as we know it, and a criminal justice system as we know it. And so it stalled a little bit, but we were able to get it out and get it passed unanimously.
And we have the floor sponsor of the bill here, Senator Anderegg. Can you tell us about your experience coming to decide to be the floor sponsor of this bill, as you hail from the other side of the aisle, for instance?
Not just from the other side, from the way other side.
That's right.
I'll tell you, it was interesting. I get this phone call from a reporter saying, hey, have you seen that the Utah Constitution still allows for slavery? and Representative Hollins is going to be running a bill to take this out. Do you have something to say? You know, being a conservative Republican from Utah County, heck yeah. You know, so I was like, yeah, it's still there. I mean, we didn't take this out years ago. I mean, so it was a no-brainer. I think that they were looking for the other side's opinion, and they were looking for a news story. And I didn't give it to him. I said, look, I'll help. So I reached out to Sandra. I think I texted her right after getting off the phone with that reporter, and I said, hey, if you need help with this, I'm on board. It's just a no-brainer. It was like, I believe the people I know on my side of the aisle, the people I associate with are not racists. Many are shocked to find out that this was even in the Constitution still. And it was not hard to jump on board and help this through. It's one of those rare bills, even though we did do a small amendment in the Senate to just make it absolutely clear that judges still have discretion for assigning, as part of a sentencing, assigning community service, but there's no servitude. They don't have to go work if they, you know, so they just wanted clarification in the language, which is what we got on the Senate side, but it passed unanimously in House committee and House floor. It passed unanimously in Senate committee and Senate floor. So except for just kind of getting some clarifying language, it was a no-brainer. So I think that the values I personally espouse, that my district espouses, is that this was the right thing to do. I've had a lot of people reach out and say, yeah, but is this going to have a practical application in today's criminal justice system? Probably not much. I mean, I don't think that this is something that is even anywhere in the realm of what's being even contemplated with our criminal justice system, but the message it sends is crystal clear. Our values as citizens of the state of Utah is that this is not appropriate. We do not, and have never, at least as far as I know, and as the people I represent, would ever support anything like this. Therefore, it's got to be taken out. So it was easy to jump on board.
And can I add to that? When I was up at the Capitol and I was working on this bill, and I spoke to some leadership in the Republican Party while I was up at the Capitol, and I told them what I was doing. Their first response was, we want to help you. Please let us help you on this. We want this to be not about Democrats or Republicans. We want everyone to be working on this together. We want this to be a bipartisan effort on this. And so they were very, very supportive. And so I was happy when Jake reached out to me, because I was sitting there thinking, who is going to be my Senate sponsor on this? Who am I going to get? Because I wanted a Republican in the Senate to run it. And so when he reached out to me, it was like, okay, this is a sign. This is who it needs to be. It was perfect.
And Senator Anderegg, you brought up some of the questions and maybe even misconceptions that people have around this issue. And I thought, Jason, you might be really the most expert at speaking to the legal implications of this. Does Constitutional Amendment C have implications on our criminal justice system or on our corrections system in Utah?
So I think the short answer is no, it doesn't have like an immediate practical effect. When we think about how somebody takes a case from A to Z in the criminal context. And then that issue about not having community service available as an option for judges, I actually practiced law as a criminal defense attorney, public defender in Colorado before coming to Utah. And that was a concern that was raised by the Mesa County elected prosecutor, that he came out against it because he didn't think that judges could do community service, that sort of thing. I spoke to my public defender colleagues back in Colorado, and they said that has had no impact whatsoever. As far as looking at our case law and who's litigated these issues around this part of our Constitution, it actually comes up in some interesting cases of tax purposes. And so I actually couldn't find any case law that directed whatever discussion that they were having about this particular part of the Constitution. And so I think from a practical standpoint that it really isn't going to have impact in Utah. But I think in the sense of like how case mechanics work, or how procedurally how a case flows through the system. But the reality, though, is that it is important to understand that that part of our Constitution is evidence that we don't have a legitimate criminal justice system or criminal legal system. I think even the phrase criminal justice is, some people are saying, a misnomer, where maybe somebody who looks like me maybe gets criminal justice. But there's a criminal legal system that impacts people in very different ways. And so this part of our Constitution is really problematic because it is saying that at one point in our country, and we need to acknowledge this, we also need to get rid of these issues hanging around us, is that at one point in our country, this just became a proxy for slavery. And as Mr. Burch put together very eloquently, that has lasted for a very long time until this day. And so it's a really good way for us to it's a really good way for us to address these historical issues, bring them to light, see how they impact what's going on right now, because we know there's racial disparities in our criminal legal systems. That's a fact. That's not up for debate. We know that different community demographics are impacted at higher rates than other people. That's a fact. And so here, by calling attention to this history and acknowledging it, it helps us move forward and think better about our systems, how we can do better with these systems, and also give another sense of legitimacy to the criminal legal system that we haven't had since the inception of our country.
Yes, thank you. And is slavery or servitude currently practiced in the Utah corrections system in the state?
So that's a really good question, because I think that this is where we understand the practical applications of people that are laborers in our prison system. And so I think when you look at how people are paid for the work that they do in prison, it's literally cents. It's usually your hourly rate is less than $1. If you look at people that fight fires, you might get like a daily rate plus any time that you're fighting a fire. And so the amount of money that you actually get paid and whether or not those are like quote unquote like slave wages, that's part of the discussion right now. And part of that issue too is that when you do work in prison systems, those job skills that you get may not translate to the real world because people look at your felony conviction and think, I'm not going to hire you. We just don't do that. Or for example, one of my previous clients who ended up doing firefighting in Colorado would go out, fight fires. And for him, that was a really important thing for his experience because when he was out there fighting fires, he wasn't somebody in prison, he was a firefighter. And so the community looked at him in a different way. And for him, that was super rewarding. But when he got out, he had all these certificates that he did this stuff, but he could never get hired by a fire department. They would never hire him. Interestingly, I just saw today that California passed a law that allowed people to become firefighters that had that experience in prison for nonviolent convictions, right? That's its own separate discussion too about what type of convictions allow you to get access to those employment opportunities. But right now, I think the question is like not necessarily involuntary servitude, but are you getting paid for your time and your effort? And then for the skills that you do get, can you actually translate those to a real job market? And so I think even though we may not have involuntary servitude in that sense or slavery in that sense, we do have something that is maybe not too far away in a lot of different capacities. Not to say that it's exactly the same thing and kind of do discredit to the legacy and terrible things that happened during slavery. But that's another part of this discussion that as this topic continues, it's going to continue evolving and we're going to have to keep working at it to get it right.
And just to clarify, is it accurate to say that community service can be used as a portion of a sentence in a conviction, but employment is not? Employment is a voluntary situation within a prison in Utah. Is that correct?
That's a great question. I'm gonna give you my best lawyer answer. It depends on how you think about it. So when you get on, one of the conditions of parole in Utah is employment. And I think it's like 32 hours a week or something. And if you violate a condition of your parole, that's a technical violation that can send you back to prison. And so that's a tricky thing. And I think there's ways to work around that. But that's one of the standard conditions of parole. And so community service too, a lot of times it's an option. Sometimes it's community service or you can do jail time, that sort of thing. So there's some like wiggle room as far as like what employment is required. But in certain contexts, you could say, yeah, that employment may be required as a condition of community supervision, right? And the alternative, of course, is being in prison or being in jail.
I'm going to jump over to some of the questions coming in from the audience since we're on this legalese track and they seem to apply to this conversation. First, aren't community service assignments usually filling volunteer roles at community or nonprofit organizations and not work that would usually be paid for?
Generally, yeah, I think most people to be applying to do community service at nonprofits. And also, too, interestingly, in Salt Lake City, you could do, at least at one point, I think it's still ongoing, participate in different programs like the Tai Chi program in downtown Salt Lake City. So there's other opportunities to think about community service and the type of work, because sometimes the way judges are thinking now is a lot of times that's self-work, right? That you can work on yourself. But the kind of traditional way of thinking about it is helping others as well.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. What is the legalese of the term slavery?
Yeah, that sounds like an entire seminar.
The question
So,
is on, can we challenge it on Utah's anti-discrimination laws? It was considered a commodity in a trade and didn't fall under the conundrum of civil rights.
yeah, so I think the history of that, and if anybody else wants to jump in on this, but I think in America we have chattel slavery. So the idea of people as property, and so this idea of human rights didn't apply because you were owned property. And so you could partake in slave leasing programs where you can lease out your property. And if that person gets hurt or injured, or maybe the person that had your lease, and I'm very uncomfortable saying these terms because it's so awful, but if they would damage that person or hurt that person or maim them or kill them, they looked at it through property laws. It wasn't about being a person and being a human. And so there's court cases that held that if you would injure somebody that you had leased, a person, that you wouldn't face criminal charges because it didn't apply because that person was actually property. And so conceptually in the United States, the way that we use the term slavery, it's a term of property as opposed to personhood, and those idea of like rights and civil rights and human rights don't apply.
Right. And when we look at slavery, there's a lot of things as far as the description that Jason just gave from owners having insurance on slaves for just such an occasion as the slave got injured. There was a huge insurance market that surrounded that. But when we look at in colonial Virginia, the first Africans here were not slaves. And that's why it's so significant that in the 13th Amendment, it says slavery and indenturement, because those are two entirely different things. Indentured mean that you could, one, earn your way out of service to another person, and perhaps even had a time limit on it. Slavery, as it was constituted from 1619 to 1705, when all of these slave codes were created in Virginia, literally means that this person no longer has rights as an individual. They are property. So from the time in 1619 that these folks came in as indentured servants, progressively laws was created to remove their rights to there. By 1705, they're no longer persons, they are property.
And also, let me add on to that. When Robert was talking about the Black codes earlier, I can't remember if he mentioned this or not, but that part of that was to put people back into slavery to make them property of the state, with the goal being to lease them out. And so the states were making money. They would lease these individuals out to different corporations, different companies, different farms, in order to earn a profit. So it was for economic reasons. So they became property of the state again with this, with the Black codes.
Okay, a follow-up.
So it goes from kind of corporate ownership to a penal industrial ownership. You're still working for industry. It's just how you come into the system. You're no longer corporately owned by individuals. You're owned by the penal system for the benefit of industry.
Thank you for that clarification. There's another clarifying question from the audience. The question is, isn't slave labor in prison a racist issue because the incarceration of prisoners is a function of racist practices in the criminal justice system in general?
I'll jump in here.
Okay, go ahead, Jason.
Okay. So just real quickly, that the idea of like criminal legal system itself is an issue of race, because historically that's how it's been couched. So when we speak about criminal legal system and who it impacts and how it works, a lot of times it's been used as a way to leverage power against certain demographics. And it's usually people of color, Black and Indigenous. And so that's just the reality of how the system works, how it sets up. And that's why when you have things like the Justice Reinvestment Initiative from 2015, if you don't explicitly talk about race in it, then you're definitely going to miss the mark, because what you're going to see is disparities increase. Even if prison populations go down, those disparities get bigger. And that was true in Utah, right? The disparities get worse for people going into prison. After we got legislation that was supposed to help everybody, but it doesn't, because nobody accounted for race. And that's just how embedded this issue is in our system.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at that kind of thing, is that, again, going back to 1619, these laws were specifically set up over time to ensure that the criminal or the penal system works against people. And so what we're looking at now is even that type of attitude has been projected from 400 years ago to everything that we think today, because we really didn't consider this with amount of seriousness people of African descent being able to be a legitimate part of government until the 1950s and the 1960s. And I was born in 61, so we're talking about in my lifetime, has it ever really been seriously considered that a Black man could be a mayor, a governor, or a president? And so that criminal system was set up specifically so that democracy could always remain white and always eliminate people of color. But also, when you look at it, again, going back to some of the movies we've seen, that chain gang still was applied to poor white men. So it becomes more than just a factor of color, but of class, you know, because there were certain white people who were looked down upon too, and were treated in a lot of sense the same way African Americans are. And when you're looking at a state like Utah, where there's predominantly poor white men in the penal system, then you have to ask yourself, why do we still do this? If not because there's some kind of benefit that people get from a penal system of poor, uneducated men.
Okay, so I think that's a really helpful explanation. Thank you all for weighing in on these questions. The legal portion of this is perhaps the most confusing to folks, and I appreciate you spending some time on this. We've talked about the potential legal implications of removing this language, showing that there generally isn't much. However, are there legal implications of not removing this language from the Utah Constitution?
Yeah, so I think again that goes to this idea of like, how do we think about the legitimacy of our criminal legal system? And as long as that language exists in there, we just need to reckon with the fact that that is based on a racist ideology that upheld white supremacy since the inception of those laws, right, and before then. And so as far as like how this could be legally maneuvered, right, in a way to keep somebody to do community service, I think realistically, no judge is going to write an opinion that says, oh yeah, this is like really good idea, let's give credence to this law and then make our criminal legal system legitimate based on this. That just isn't going to work super well. So I think from a practical standpoint, not removing the language isn't necessarily going to change how cases work. Again, I spoke to some of my former colleagues in Colorado about this that are defense attorneys. They didn't really see much of a difference around their practice day in and day out. But again, as that legislation was being passed, so the amendment was passed, there's some different ideas that kind of came out of the woodwork to show some of the underlying issues that they had in their system that do feed into a lot of these issues that we face today.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about other implications of this potential change, moral and social implications. As former State Senator Scott Howell said in his testimony in favor of HJR 8 during the House committee hearing, he said, words matter. So why does it matter to remove wording about slavery from our state constitution? You've all sort of spoken around this, but let's just say it loud and clear once again. Why does this matter?
I thought Robert, okay, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, Sandra. Okay, so one of the things that I thought about this considerably is that as we look at ourselves as a society, and especially in these days where we're kind of throwing the Constitution around and what the Constitution actually means, it has a great moral implication to whether or not we abide by what the Constitution is set up to do. And so part of what I found is that we tend to miss a very important part of even the preamble to the Constitution that talks about promote general welfare. We tend to forget that morally we are founded as a commonwealth, that we want to be able to take care of each other. And so when we kind of skirt over the idea of taking care of everyone's need and caring about everyone's need, we kind of make ourselves morally incapable of true leadership, as we like to say that we have, especially when we're looking at it from around the world. We're just bored of that truthfulness and leadership, because as a country, we're not facing some of the first items of our Constitution, that is to take care of everyone. And so we're not doing that. We're not taking care of everyone's well-being. We're taking care of certain people's well-being. And also, I believe that the Constitution itself was set up with a legislature, a presidency, judiciary, to make sure that we are given the opportunity to correct the errors that we make. And we're given the opportunities to take care of the needs of people. And so it would naturally follow that if we should see that there is a need that needs to be corrected or need to be met, then we would do that, because our Constitution allows us the flexibility of that kind of change to morally take care of each other with, and at the same time keeping the government itself in place and safe so that you don't fall apart in the process of trying to take care of it. So we have the opportunity, it's given to us to correct these kind of things. And so we should do that.
Great. Anybody want to add anything else to that?
Sure. As when I debated this on the House floor, brought this on the House floor, one of the things I read was the Declaration of Independence, the part that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, I'm gonna add men and women are created equal. And that as we're having this conversation around equality right now and what that looks like and how do we as a state move forward, I think that taking this out of our Constitution kind of solidifies that we need to start living up to the promises that our Constitution, that our Declaration of Independence that has promised us, that we are created equal and that we do have the same rights and privileges across the board, no matter what race or culture you are. And I think it is important that we take this out, because I think it just sends a very powerful statement that we are all created equal, and that we need to start looking at closing that book or that chapter in our history in this state, because it no longer reflects who we are.
Andrea, can I also add something? I agree 100%. And Representative Hollins, who is our only African-American legislator currently, when she stands to speak to these issues, it carries a lot of weight. But I think fundamentally, morally, I was raised in a white suburban home in Sandy. I think I had 2 Black kids in my school, all growing up. It just, there's just not a lot of diversity in Utah back in the 70s and 80s growing up. There just wasn't. Every time an NBA team would come into town, it would more than double our population, it felt like. So it was one of those things where, and I'm getting a little heat. I'm just telling you honestly, I'm getting a little heat from the uber right on my side saying, why are you doing this? This is a message bill. This has no practical application. Let's focus on other real important stuff. And I've had to push back a little bit going, this is important stuff, because when Representative Hollins and I started talking about this was before COVID, this is before the racial tensions re-flared up. So now it kind of seems like, ooh, this is in response to that. In reality, this was in motion before the racial tension flared up again. But it still, I think, is fundamental to the fact that I was raised in a way that treated everybody equally. And it's hard for me to understand how people don't understand that about people, regardless of their color, you know? So when this opportunity came up, it was a no-brainer for me. It was just like, well, of course. And if people don't understand that this is turning a chapter saying, not only can we say it, now we actually mean it, and we have the ability to move forward without the evidence that this was part of our history. If that doesn't mean anything to you, you've got a lot to learn, in my opinion. You weren't raised the right way. So for me personally, this was me being able to stand up and say, I agree 100%. And I don't believe the ways that, you know, everything in the media says that my party believes and whatnot. And the fact that our party of the Republicans working with the Democrats to get this passed unanimously says a lot for what our values truly are. You're always going to have the outliers, but as citizens of the state of Utah, we truly do try to look at people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin.
Thank you. You know, I think it could be helpful for folks who don't understand the constitutional amendment process to get some, maybe perhaps Senator Anderegg or Representative Hollins, you can explain why was there a resolution in 2019 and then now a question on the statewide ballot in 2020? Why must Utah voters ultimately decide on this issue if legislators already voted unanimously in favor?
Representative?
Because in order to change the Constitution, we have to go to the public. It has to pass by two-thirds. Is it two-thirds, Jake? Is it in the House?
Actually, no, so to pass, it has to be 2/3, a supermajority in the House
Yes.
and Senate to get on
Yes.
the ballot.
Yes.
If it doesn't go the initiative way, but then it only takes a simple majority on the vote.
Yeah, on the vote. And so, because it's what we have to do is the law and how we have to go about changing anything in our state constitution.
Mm-hmm. And can we talk about who supports Constitutional Amendment C besides the entirety of the state legislature? Who are some of the organizations or leaders who have spoken up in favor of Constitutional Amendment C, pardon?
Sure. We have that besides the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. We've had Alliance for a Better Utah. We've had Action Utah, who've been an awesome supporter. I'm trying to think of everybody who's there. I wish I had the list. We've had Black fraternities and sororities that are here in the state of Utah. We had my sorority, Delta Sigma Theta. We had Alpha Kappa Alpha. We had Omega Psi Phi, which Robert is a member of. Am I leaving anybody out, Robert? Do you know? Am I leaving anybody else who has spoken? The NAACP has spoke. Utah Black Roundtable.
Right.
Am I leaving anybody out that you all are aware of?
I don't have the email in front of me because it was listed in the email. But yeah, I think you hit just about everybody.
I thought it was worth quoting from some of the legislators from the House hearing who spoke up in favor as well. As you said, Representative Hollins, nobody spoke out against this measure in the House. But some of these quotes I thought were really interesting to convey. Representative Brady Brammer, a Republican from Pleasant Grove, said the language of our documents matter within the perceived justice of our system. Representative Travis Siegmiller, a Republican from St. George, said, "What a tragedy that it has taken us so long to get to it." Mm-hmm. Representative Eric Hutchings, a Republican from Kearns, said, "Everybody in a moment of unity can do the right thing and make the right statement." Representative Steve Waldrop, a Republican from Ogden, said, "It's about time." And Representative Lowry Snow, a Republican from St. George, said, "It is important to our state and who we are." And he also said, "It's time that we fix this in our United States Constitution as well." So a lot of positivity from the legislators from both sides of the aisle there. Has anyone spoken up in opposition to Constitutional Amendment C?
I have not received a lot of pushback. Senator Anderegg spoke a little bit earlier about some of the pushback he's received. I have received maybe a couple of emails from individuals pushing back, but there has not been a really big pushback I have seen for this amendment.
Okay, thank you. We do have a few more questions from the audience, and then we will wrap.
I haven't seen.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm having a delay here. Well, I was going to say I haven't seen a lot of opposition. I just have, I'll just say this. I think that in practice of the law, this change will probably have not a major impact as far as how the legal justice system works. So I do get some pushback just from people saying this is just a message bill. Well, okay, potentially, but this is one heck of a powerful message that has a lot of history to it. And it's the right thing to do because our documents, I think Representative Brammer's quote was spot on. Our documents reflect the aspects of how we approach our interactions with each other as citizens, with our governments. And if our documents don't reflect adequately how our true values are concerned, that's a problem. It's a problem. So I haven't gotten a lot of pushback from many organizations. I've gotten some of the uber right libertarian type groups that are just like, do something that matters. Let's repeal public education. Okay. So you understand who's reaching out that's concerned with this. But by and large, I haven't had a single legitimate organization have any issue with this. I will be shocked if this doesn't pass relatively very unanimous on the ballot. That's all I'll say.
And could I add to that also, you mentioned earlier about the 13th Amendment. I have been a part of a larger conversation that is happening right now with people who from different states, they're organizing to start looking at the 13th Amendment and how we can get this out of our Utah Constitution. So that conversation is being had right now.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a few more questions from the audience before we wrap this up. A question, what is the economic impact to the state of this? What wages will be required to pay prison labor?
Yeah, go ahead, Senator, sorry.
Well, I'm the chair of the Executive Offices and Criminal Justice Appropriations Subcommittee. So obviously the prison budget is my budget. But my understanding is specific to those that do work, meaning who are employed within the prison system. And I think it's grades 1, 2, and 3 are not eligible for employment in working. Grades 4 and 5 in the prison system are eligible with good behavior and whatnot. They get paid, and it's not much. It's a couple of dollars an hour. But my understanding is the program itself is kind of self-perpetuating. We don't actually put money into it. I can look into that a little bit more. So at this point, I don't think there is any sort of like minimum wage requirement. And maybe Jason has more detail on it, having worked in the legal profession. But at this point, I don't know that we've ever had an active discussion as to what is the minimum amount or what we should be paying.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I think that's an ongoing conversation that is kind of bubbling under the surface of this one, but I don't think it's actually going to change how that works at the moment.
Yeah.
Great. Okay,
Right.
thank you. Final question. Have any churches spoken up to support this?
I have not got an official statement from any of the organized religions in the state of Utah saying that they are for or against this, but we're still at the coalition that we have is still at the beginning phase, where we are reaching out to different organizations and different and to different religions, asking for their support and asking if maybe they could look at educating their congregations and why this is important.
Yeah, thank you. I recall also that Jean Hill from the Catholic Diocese also spoke up in favor during the House.
That's right. That's right. She did. She did come in and speak up in favor of it and support it. Thank you for reminding me.
Well, I just have to thank you all so much for contributing your expertise, your energy towards this. As you said, Representative Hollins, in full disclosure, Action Utah absolutely supports Constitutional Amendment C, and we encourage voters to vote yes on November 3rd. But we appreciate everybody coming and contributing to a conversation in a civil way and asking your questions from the audience. Thank you for participating. This has been a really robust conversation, and I really appreciate all your time. In addition, I wanted to let you know that you can find more information out about this and other constitutional amendment questions at actionutah.org. Check out our 2020 voter guide for more information. And I'd like to invite you as well to join us for upcoming What's on Your Ballot events on September 17th at 6 p.m. We will be discussing Constitutional Amendment G on education funding. On September 30th, we'll do an overview of all 7 constitutional amendment questions that will appear on your ballot. And on October 15th at noon, we'll be talking about who is on your ballot, what types of candidates you can expect to see, and how you can learn more about them so you can cast an informed ballot. For other important election reminders, we encourage you to take our voter pledge. It's a great way to commit to voting this year, and you'll receive from us periodic reminders about important election information. So we hope this event has been helpful to you to keep you informed, not only to cast a vote in the 2020 election, but also to encourage other people to vote as well and to disseminate this information and pass it along. So big thanks to everybody here, to all our wonderful panelists, for participating, and we hope to see you at another event soon.